Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you guys. The last thing that was on my mind when I applied to go on this TV show was that I'd eventually wind up using it to share the love of Christ. And the fact that I'm able to do that now, just it blows my mind. And so again, I'm really thankful for this opportunity to come and speak to you men. And anytime I get the chance to talk about bladesmithing and talk about Jesus and then mix those two things together, well, you know, I'm just a happy guy. So like they said, I'm from Jackson, Mississippi. I'm not a bladesmith full-time. It's a hobby. It's what I do to kind of relieve stress. You know, I work at a hospital in the IT department, kind of a high-stress environment, 24/7 uptime, all that kind of stuff. And it's nice every once in a while to be able to get out in the shop and grab a hammer and just really lay into something. So that's kind of the reason why I keep doing what I'm doing. It's really a nice stress release. But I'll be honest with you, when Mark asked me to come and speak, my gut reaction was to come up with some excuse why I shouldn't or couldn't. I think I've heard it said a bunch of times that one of the number one fears is public speaking, and I share that. I'm definitely like Moses when it comes to that, Lord. I feel like I'm slow of speech, and so my initial reaction was to say no, but he caught me a year ago, you know, and what kind of guy says no to something a year in advance? So, you know, here I am. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, anyway, as I said, I did appear on Forged in Fire. And just show of hands real quick. This is no big deal. I run into people all the time. Who has never seen an episode of Forged in Fire in here? Cool. All right, good. That means I get to talk about it a little bit more. So those of you that raised your hands, have you ever seen the show Chopped on the Food Network? Yeah, a lot more people have seen Chopped than have seen Forged in Fire. But think of Forged in Fire as you would Chopped. You know, in Chopped, they give the chefs some weird food item that then they have to turn around and make some gourmet meal, right? Well, in Forged in Fire, they give 4 bladesmiths some weird material or some strange piece of steel, and then those guys are tasked with turning that into a knife. And they start with 4 bladesmiths, and they immediately knock one guy out after the first round, and they're left with 3. And then those 3 guys have to go on and put handles on the blade that they made in round 1. And then those 3 guys' knives are tested in an extreme fashion. You know, they do all kinds of chops on bone and steel, and they basically try to destroy the knife. And in the last 2 guys standing, whoever has the 2 knives that took the least amount of damage, those 2 guys are the finalists, and they go on to make some weapon of historical significance. And so you get to go home to your home shop, and for 5 days a camera crew follows you around while you make some weapon. In my case, I got to make a 17th century French small sword, which when I was doing my research, they said it was basically the 9mm of their day. You know, it was the everyman's sword. It was the sword on the hip of every gentleman. So it was a 32-inch long sword. It was fairly intricate. It was a stressful process to make that sword in 5 days and then turn around and have it tested. But in the end, my sword wound up performing better than the other guys, and I won my episode. And so that was all nice and neat. And you know, I didn't go on the show expecting to win. My idea was just to not do anything stupid, and because I knew that it was going to be recorded for history, and you know, I didn't want to always have to look back at that and go, oh man, you know. But fortunately, things kind of went my way. There's a lot of luck involved. Anybody that goes on those kind of shows can tell you that, you know, there's a lot of chance that happens. But looking back now, I really believe that God was watching over me through that whole process. I just, you know, they say hindsight is 20/20. I really believe that. And so I wanted to talk to you guys tonight about a few principles that the Lord has laid on my heart that are parallels between bladesmithing, and I might use the term blacksmithing. I do a lot of blacksmithing as well. Between bladesmithing or blacksmithing and our walk as Christian men. Because I really think there's some really neat parallels between those two. And so I've got some examples that the Lord's laid on my heart from before, during, and after the whole Forged in Fire experience. So I'm going to start in John 8. If you got a Bible, turn over to John chapter 8 and put a finger there, and then put a finger over in Matthew 5. So in John chapter 8, verse 12, when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I'll flip over back to Matthew 5, verse 14. This is in the Sermon on the Mount. Starting in verse 14, he says, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So those two verses are about what? They're about light, right? And there's an I and a you. In one verse, Jesus says, I am the light. And in the other verse, he says, you are the light. So about a year or two before I went on Forged in Fire, I participated in a group in Jackson called the Mississippi Forge Council. It's just a bunch of old guys that get together once a month, and we talk about blacksmithing, and we do demonstrations and stuff. But once a year, we are demonstrators for this thing called the Fall Harvest Fest at the Mississippi Ag Museum. If you've ever been to Jackson and gone to the Ag Museum, they've got this street, and it looks like a town out of like Little House on the Prairie. You know, there's a church, and there's a blacksmith shop, and there's a lumber mill, and there's farm animals, and general store, and the doctor's office. And so once a year, these schools come, and they bring about 3,000 children through that area over about 3 or 4 days. And so as the Mississippi Forge Council, we're asked to come and demonstrate as blacksmiths, you know, just to be in there and to work. And so a few years ago, it was my turn to do the demonstration on one of those days, and I had never done it before. And even though it was just a bunch of like 4th and 5th graders, I was still kind of nervous because I wanted to do a good job. You know, I didn't want to be the guy in there that couldn't hit the anvil right, you know. And so I spent a lot of time. I spent like a week leading up to that practicing making wall hooks, which is really simple. It's a simple bend and a twist, you know, something you can make that a blacksmith can make pretty quick. But I wanted to do it so that I could do it really quickly without thinking while I was talking. So I practiced a lot. I got all this material together. I cut my material into the right lengths. I had all this stuff together. I got kind of this blacksmith get-up where I had this apron, you know, and these older-looking pants and this shredded denim shirt that I thought kind of looked like a period-correct blacksmith. And anyway, I did all this preparation and got there that morning. And sure enough, here comes all the kids. You know, it's like 60 kids show up in this little blacksmith shop that's, you know, it's a pretty small area, and it's a dark, dirty blacksmith shop, and there's like 60 kids crowded around. And so I'm excited. I've rehearsed a speech to tell the kids about the history of blacksmithing and about how kids their age were instrumental in a blacksmith shop because apprentices were little kids back then, and I had all this stuff ready. And so I launched into my speech with these kids, and I put a piece of steel in the fire while I was talking, and I launched into my speech, and I could just see their eyes just glazing over. You know, they just didn't care. You know, they just did not care, and I could see pretty quickly that I was losing them. You know, they were starting to whip their phones out, and so so I thought, all right, well, look, let me do what I've been practicing. So I turned around and I grabbed the steel out of the fire, and as I whip around to come to the anvil, the steel is like, when it comes out of that fire, it's bright. It's glowing. It's like super bright in a dark blacksmith shop. And all these kids went, wow. And they were blown away. And I was like, I hadn't even started yet, And so I was like, oh, cool. That's neat. Glad you like that. Watch this. And so I started hitting the steel, and it shot sparks out. And again, they went, ooh, ah. And so I went through my routine, and I made my hook, and I gave my little spiel about how hooks were simple items that the blacksmith would sell to make money and blah, blah, blah. And again, their eyes were starting to glaze over. And I got finished, and I realized when I was done that they didn't care about anything that I had just done except when I pulled that steel out of the fire. When I pulled that steel out of the fire, I had left it in there a little too long. And if you leave steel in a coal forge for too long, it turns into a sparkler. And that's when you know you've ruined it. But those kids didn't care. What they saw was a sparkler. They saw this light come out. And it was like 3 days later that it hit me. I mean, I was sitting at work, and just out of the blue, this thought came in my head. It wasn't what I did. It certainly wasn't me that they were impressed with. It wasn't the item that I made that they were impressed with. What impressed those kids was the transformation that they saw. They saw a cold, dirty piece of steel that's dull gray in color go into a fire, and then when it came out, it was glowing. And there was all this light in the room. That's what lit those kids up. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, that's for us as Christians, that's what people care about. People don't care much about us, really. What they care about is that transformation that happens when they see the old us go away and the new us in Christ appear. When they see that transformation happen, that's when people get the same ooh and ah that those kids had when I pulled that steel out of the fire. So that was the first kind of parallel that was kind of mind-blowing to me as a blacksmith. I thought, this is a really neat parallel between the Christian life and blacksmithing. And another thing about these verses I just read, I think is pretty interesting. In John 8, Jesus is teaching there. And the Pharisees interrupt his teaching by bringing this woman in who's caught in adultery, and they throw her down in front of him, and they say, what do you think about this? They're trying to catch him in an argument, or try to catch him in a trap, right? And they accuse her and throw her down, and we all know what Jesus does in that story. He kneels down in the dirt, and he starts writing something in the dirt. And he looks around, and he says, you without sin cast the first stone. And of course, everybody kind of drops their rocks, and they back away, and they leave. And then Jesus looks at the woman and says, I don't see any of your accusers here, and neither do I accuse you. Go and sin no more. And then he picks right up, and he starts talking, and it says, when Jesus spoke again to the people, he says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And I thought that was really cool, that Jesus gets interrupted by this really dark situation, And the very first thing he picks up saying after that situation is taken care of is about how we're supposed to be light. And I got to thinking about that too. When I make a blade in the shop, one of the processes that I go through, if you've watched the show, you'll see the guys, they hammer on the blade for a while and they stick it in the forge and it's real bright. And you might see them every once in a while take that knife and they kind of wave it around in the air. They're like cooling it off. Well, what they're doing there is it's a process called normalization. And so when you forge a piece of steel and you get it all bright and hot and you bang it into this new shape, you introduce a lot of stress into the steel. And so in order to relax that stress and to even out what's called the grain structure in the steel, in order to make it really, which makes the blade tough, in order to do that, you do this thing called normalization where you get the blade hot and you cool it off. And in a blacksmith shop, the only way to know that you're ready for the next step in normalization is to know that all the heat has gone out of your blade. And so in my shop, where I do most of my work, I got bright LED lights in the shop. And so I'll take the steel out of my forge, and it's bright, and I can see it glowing like yellow, and then it goes to orange, and then it goes to red, and then it kind of goes to this dull gray. And I've noticed that, oh, it's gray. I think I can go back in for another normalization cycle. But I noticed as soon as I think it's gray, I can go to this little cubby over here behind my workbench that's super dark. It's the only dark place in my shop that's out of the way of all these lights. And I can stick that knife into that dark place, and it always, thank you, I must be sounding rough. But it always shows a little bit of light still in that blade. You know, out in the light, I don't see the light, and I don't see the glow in the steel anymore. But as soon as I stick it in that super dark hole, oh wow, there's still a lot of heat in there. I need to wait a little longer. I need to wait for it to cool down a little bit more. And it struck me, where is light the most effective? It's in the dark. And it doesn't take much. I mean, it just takes a tiny little bit of light to be seen in darkness. And so when I was reading these passages about light, you know, it came to me, and I started thinking about my experience going on this TV show and winning and all that. And one of the things that I look back, you know, I said hindsight is 20/20 a minute ago, you know, and a lot of times I think as Christians, it's easy for us to look in the past and say, you know, God was really moving there because I'm right here. I have no doubt. You know, you can always kind of look back. At least it's easier for me to kind of look back and see what's going on. And a couple of years before going on Forged in Fire, I got intensely interested in Christian apologetics, which is the study of the defense of the faith. You know, it's basically how to reason using logic and evidence, how to reason out your faith with non-believers, basically. So somebody comes up to you and says, yeah, you know, that Jesus guy was all right. You know, I try to do the best I can, but I don't really believe in God, and I think it's silly that you do. Well, you know, apologetics gives you a way to talk to that person in a reasonable, gracious manner to get through your arguments, to clearly and succinctly explain why you believe what you believe. And so I got really interested in that years before I went on the show. And so I applied to get on the show, went on the show. I had, between the time I went on that TV show and the time I could tell people that I won was 6 months. I had to keep it a secret for a long time. But when it did finally, when my episode finally aired, you know, how many of you guys are on Facebook? A lot. I mean, it's kind of, we all use Facebook to keep up with family and talk to friends and whatnot. It's kind of like how people talk to each other now. But what do you think happened to my Facebook account when that episode hit the air? Man, it went nuts. I mean, literally, my phone was just jumping around for a good 36 hours. I mean, people from Russia, people from, I'm not kidding, people from Russia, and I was thinking, how did they see the episode? It hadn't even aired yet, but they're watching hack television, you know, and people all over the planet saw this episode and were reaching out to me and sending me messages saying, oh, how did you do that? Or, you know, congratulations. And while that was really neat, it was kind of like, it was a little overwhelming. And so, like I said at the beginning, I'd been kind of thinking, how does this all fit in my life as a Christian man? And so I got to thinking, even before I went on the show, I was thinking, well, what if I do win? You know, what is going to happen? Am I going to get a bunch of people calling me, asking me to make them a sword, you know? And so how do I handle that? And so I was intentional with this particular part. I went on to all my social media accounts, Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and I went under my profile and I tacked the words Christ follower on there, all right? And so it says, I think on Instagram it says, Mississippi craftsman, Christ following husband. And I'm not saying this to say, look at me, look what I did, you know. I'm saying I was intentional with that because I knew people were going to reach out to me, and they did. I mean, they really did. People started, my follower count on these social media things went into the thousands just in a few days. And I kid you not, I had dozens and dozens of people send me direct messages saying, oh, I see you're a Christian. And out of those dozens and dozens of messages that started like that, about half of them would say, thank you for doing what you're doing. And about the other half would say, that's ridiculous. I don't know how you can believe in that. But it opened up this opportunity for these discussions that I would not have been prepared to deal with had I not been driven into apologetics a couple of years before. I'd really have had no way to deal with some of these discussions or some of these arguments against the faith had I not done that deep dive. And I don't know where that deep dive came from. I don't know where the desire to dive into that came from, other than from the Holy Spirit and from God. And so now looking back, I look at that trajectory of the interest in apologetics and this weird fame thing that happened, and then the ability to use that apologetic stuff to discuss properly with all these people. And some of those conversations really went to some great places. Some of them ended abruptly, you know. But in any case, I was ready for it. And so I started thinking, shortly after the show aired, I was thinking, this is one small way that I can inject light into darkness. And so that was one practical way that I tried to follow that advice and to be a light bringer. And so my admonition to you as Christian men is, you might think it's silly to engage in that way on social media. I know when I first started, I was thinking, I'd much rather talk face to face to someone about Christ. But so much communication now happens in that forum, you know, that I think now it's silly not to use it in that way. And so for me, that was just one small application of trying to be a light bringer. Those online interactions, I don't think would have been nearly as effective had I not been prepared for them, you know. And the fact that I would never have had that opportunity had I not gone onto this silly TV show just seemed to be, I don't know, there was a weight to it. You know, it just seemed to me that God was in that somehow. And I think online, you don't have to be out there very long to see darkness. You know, you scroll through your Facebook feed or some other online interaction or Twitter, my gosh. You know, it doesn't take long to see darkness out there. But like that little blade, I stick into that dark hole and see just a little bit of light. It doesn't take an injection of much light to turn those discussions right around or shut them down, you know. And so the second thing I'd like to talk about is, if you've watched Forged in Fire, I've had a lot of people come up to me after the show and say, man, I really love the fact that on Forged in Fire, all the guys work together. And those of you that have seen the show, you've probably seen it. Four of us stand there at the beginning, and all four of us are trying to win $10,000. You know, and you would think in a lot of competitions like that, it would be cutthroat, and I'm not even going to talk to that guy. You know, but in that environment, everybody wants to help each other. Like on my episode, there was a guy named Bob. And Bob was a full-time blacksmith, been a blacksmith for 35 years. And for some reason, me and Bob just hit it off. Like the second we met in the hotel, we just hit it off. And so it just so happened that we went in to film the episode. Bob is standing at this anvil right beside me. And so when the timer starts and we're set to making our knives, me and Bob just naturally started handing tools to each other. And it wasn't like we planned it out. It wasn't like we got together before the show and said, let's work together to knock these other two chumps out. That didn't happen, It was just a natural thing. And on the other side of Bob, I could see John and Atsatsa working with each other. Because nobody wants to go home because someone wasn't able to do their best because they couldn't find a tool, or something like that. And so there's in the bladesmithing world, there's a real sense of camaraderie. There's a real sense of helping. And I've never met another bladesmith that wasn't willing to share knowledge freely. If I'm working on some kind of knife or sword or axe or something, and there's a process I don't know how to do, I can pick up my phone or text one of a number. I could even call or talk to some of the top bladesmiths in the country. And those guys will answer me, not because of who I am or anything, just because they're willing to help. And so I get that question a lot about the show. Were y'all really that nice to each other, or were you just playing around? And I'm thinking, no, that was legitimate. We were really nice to each other. And I got to thinking how people see that and they appreciate it so much. And it reminded me that as Christian men, we're called to love one another. And Jesus said, that's how you will be known, because of your love for one another. And I think that's just one of the things that jumped out to me, was that the parallel between this camaraderie on the show and the fact that as Christian men, we should have that same camaraderie. Our common goal on the show was to do our best as craftsmen. And our common goal as Christian men is to lift each other up and to lift the name of Christ, And so this came to me. I make these crosses. I make these little steel crosses a lot. And I've partnered with a ministry called Iron Man Outdoors. And what Iron Man Outdoors does is they take guys on fishing and hunting retreats over a weekend, and they do an intensive Bible study and devotional and intense discussions over the weekend using, hunting and fishing and whatnot. And at the end of the weekend, they take one of these crosses that I've made for them, and they give them to each one of the guys, and that's kind of like a memorabilia thing for the weekend, a remembrance. And so I did this special run for Iron Man Outdoors this past year. Normally I make the crosses, and it's got Iron Man Outdoors stamped on either arm of the cross, Iron Man Outdoors. And they asked me if I could do a special run with Proverbs 27:17 on it for this one weekend they were doing, where they were focusing on that verse. And everybody's heard Proverbs 27:17. It's, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another, right? And so I've heard that my whole life. And so I'm out there one night, and I'm working on these crosses. And one of my steps in making these crosses after I forge them out is I go over to my belt sander and I knock the edges off of the cross so it's comfortable in the hand, And so my belt sander broke down one night. And I was like, man, what am I going to do? I got to finish these things. I got to get them in the mail tomorrow. These guys need these by Wednesday. And so I looked on the wall, and there's a bunch of files on the wall, and I was like, well, it's time to break out the files. And so I started clamping these crosses in the vise, and I'm filing on it. And I'm sitting there with a file in my hand, and I'm literally filing on a cross that has Proverbs 27:17 stamped into it. And I'd done probably 40 of them. They're laying in a pile on the floor, and I'm just going at it, just listening to music, just zoned out, just going at it. And I mean, literally, I was like, oh my gosh. Wow. It hit me. Proverbs 27:17, iron sharpens iron. But what I'd never thought about was that iron can't sharpen iron until one piece of that duo has been transformed. So if I take two pieces of steel, let's say I take two pieces of good knife-making steel, and I rub them together, not much is going to happen. I'm not even really going to dull them. It's just going to scrape together. But if I take one of those pieces of steel and I run it through the forging process, and I forge some teeth into it, and then I put it in the fire, and I bring it up to critical temperature, and I bring it out, and I quench it, and I get it really hard, then I can take that piece of steel to the other one, and I can run it across it, and metal shaving is going to fly all over the place. And as I'm sitting there, I'm knocking corners off with this file. I was like, wow, man, how have I not ever thought about the fact that iron can't really sharpen iron until one piece has been transformed? And for some reason to me, that was just like a big light bulb. I don't know. I was just like, wow, that's cool. And it was just, I got to thinking about my time on Forged in Fire and the way that we helped each other, and the way that Bob, who had been in the blacksmithing business for 30 some odd years, was showing me things I'd never thought about. And I got to thinking, wow, man, as Christian men, those of us especially that are older, we need to be really mindful about reaching down to our younger brothers and trying to help them not make the same mistakes that we've made. Lord knows I've made a ton, And I know that we're all going to still make mistakes, but that Proverbs 27:17 took on an entirely new meaning for me. As a 47-year-old guy, it really made me think more about my responsibility as an older guy in Christ. Because I've been through that process. I've been transformed. I've made a bunch of mistakes. I have failed miserably and hurt people that I love and made all kinds of stupid mistakes. But Christ covers it. And I know that, and I can help a younger guy learn that. And so that Proverbs 27:17 thing just blew my mind when it happened. And it made me start thinking about failure. I started thinking about the things that I've done wrong that have bothered me the most, the things that have caused me to harbor the most guilt. And the fact that for a long time, some of those sins that beset me really held me in a place where I couldn't move. I was too scared. I didn't feel worthy enough. I didn't want to move because I'd already screwed up once. I didn't want to do it again, And so I just got stagnant and I just didn't move for a long time. And I got to thinking about failure in the blacksmith shop. And about how often I fail in the blacksmith shop, learn from it, and then keep going, In my shop, I've got buckets of material. I've got dozens of buckets of material. One of them's got like railroad spikes in it. One of them's got old farm implements in it. One of them's got just miscellaneous pieces of steel. Just all kinds of material in there. But I've got this one bucket that I keep near my forge. My forging area. Now, I call it the fail bucket because it's full of a bunch of failed projects. So one of the things I make a lot now is I make hammers for other blacksmiths and bladesmiths. And I'll bet you there's 20 or so failed hammerheads in that bucket. But those things are precious to me. Those ruined, cracked, deformed, weird hammerheads that are in that bucket that are failures, every last one of those things teaches me a lesson. And I can go, I could go to the shop right now, I could grab that bucket, I could bring it in here, I could pick up a hammerhead and I could look at it, and in 2 seconds I could tell you exactly what caused the failure, and then I could show you over here, well, here's the tool that I made so that I don't do that anymore. Or here's the process I learned so that doesn't happen anymore. And so I've kept that fail bucket near, and it keeps filling up. I'm still throwing stuff in there. And every once in a while, I go over there and I grab something out of the fail bucket, and I've got new skills, and I've got new ideas now. And every once in a while, I've been able to take one of those old failed hammers and rerun it through a process. And it turns out it's a beautiful hammer, and nobody really knows that it was a bad one. I can sell it. But it was in that bucket. It was useless. And then I picked it up, and it was useful. I got to thinking about that, about how on Forged in Fire, the first guy to go home, we all feel bad for that guy. But I've talked to a bunch of those guys. I've talked to a bunch of the guys that have gone home first, and not a one of them quit. Not a one of them went home and said, well, I just really did it on national TV, and now I'm done. By and large, most of those guys go home, and some of them wind up trying to make the sword that we wind up making. Whatever finale weapon was the one for their episode that they failed on, some of those guys go home, and they do it to prove to themselves that they could have made it, And so, failure is not final with a bladesmith. There's a funny saying in the bladesmith world that says bladesmiths don't make failures, they just make smaller knives. which is kind of true. A lot of times the tip might break and we can just regrind that dude and go again. But it's not failure with a Christian either. Look at some of the people that God used in the Bible. Like I said at the beginning, Moses. God called him and he said, Lord, I'm slow of speech. Don't let me speak. King David, called a man after God's own heart, murdered a man, stole his wife, tried to cover it up, then went on to write many of the Psalms. And you notice in the Psalms what David does? When David gets in trouble, he runs to God rather than running from God. Jonah, who did run from God, wound up in a whale for it, but then wound up doing what he was supposed to do. He failed at first. Gideon doubted himself 3 times, doubted God 3 times, and then went on to smash that army. Peter got so angry, he cut a man's ear off with a sword. Yeah. I like that. Then he denied he even knew Jesus, bawled his eyes out over his own betrayal, and then went on to become the rock that Christ told him he was going to be. Thomas, who said he wouldn't believe until he saw and touched the wounds in Jesus' hands and side. You know what they say about Thomas? They say Thomas went on to be a missionary in India and was martyred there. You don't do that kind of stuff unless you're really transformed, So like I said before, I've come to appreciate failure. Not only in the blacksmith and bladesmith shop. Every time I fail now there, if I'm under the gun time-wise, it really gets to me. I'm like, ah. But more often than not, I go, oh, okay, I messed up. How do I learn from that? And so it's kind of become this friend in the shop, I work alone in my shop. I don't have a teacher. I don't have anybody out there. But failure is my friend out there. It helps me to get better all the time. And I've come to appreciate it in my Christian walk. The older I've gotten, the more I've realized that my inability to forgive myself is pride. If it's always been easier for me to accept forgiveness from God and from the people I hurt than it has been for me to let go of those things that I messed up with. For some reason, I've held on to them, but the more I've dealt with failure over my life, the more I've realized that failure just does one major thing for me. It increases the grace of Christ in my life and makes me more reliant on His power and not mine. And so, the parallel for me between bladesmithing and my Christian walk with failure is that failure is one of those things, man, it sounds crazy, but I'm really starting to cherish my failures in the past because of what they've taught me, and the fact that they have brought me that much closer to Christ. And it's taken away some of the fear of failing. Like I said in the past, I was hesitant, too scared to move because I was scared to fail. Now I'm like, well, I'm gonna screw up, but I'm gonna at least try, Ephesians 2:10 this is a verse that really took some of that fear out from me. It says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." You know, I said that I wasn't really sure where Forged in Fire kind of fit when I was applying to go on the show. I applied in the second season and didn't make it. I went through this whole process where they did an interview, and then I just never heard back. And I thought, oh, okay, well, that's fine. You know, it was worth a shot. Well, then about a year later, I got a call from one of the producers, and he said, "Hey, are you still interested?" I said, "Well, I guess. You know, let me talk to my wife. Let me think about it." And so I thought about it. I prayed about it. And I don't say I prayed about it flippantly. I mean, I really prayed about it. I was like, "God, do you want me to go on a TV show?" It sounds weird, you know. It really sounds weird when I even say it now. But looking back and now looking forward, and all the doors that have opened for me to speak to guys like you, to talk to other groups, it's been amazing, you know. And so I look back and I think, man, Ephesians 2:10, God prepared beforehand. So I think that's crazy and just really neat. So the idea of fearing failure is getting smaller and smaller in my life, because I've accepted the fact that I'm going to fail, but I'm going to learn something from it, and I'm covered by the blood of Christ for it. Amen. There's a great quote by the former American ambassador Alan Keyes that's really applicable here. It says, "It is not for us to calculate our victory or fear our defeat, but to do our duty and leave the rest in God's hands." So you may not think you're useful. You may not think your skill set can be used for the kingdom. I never thought blacksmithing or bladesmithing would be something that I could use in any way for the kingdom. But what's great is that it doesn't matter what I think. You know, it doesn't matter. My inability to believe in my own abilities, it doesn't matter. Because God, if God says that he's going to use you, it doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. He's going to use you. God will handle it. He said he's already planned those things out. He's prepared them beforehand. So later this year, I read a book. It's called 7 Men by Eric Metaxas. I don't know if any of you guys have ever read that book. It's a really, really, really good book. But I wanted to end with just reading a section out of that book, but because it's just so applicable. There's a section in that book about a guy named Eric Liddell. He was called the Flying Scotsman. And Chariots of Fire is a movie that was made about the guy. And one of my favorite quotes from Eric Liddell, and I'm not really sure if this is a made-up quote that was done for the movie or if Eric Liddell really said this, but I love this quote. Eric Liddell says, "God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure." And so I kind of feel the same way. I feel like God's made me for a purpose, but he also made me good with my hands, you know. And so I make things now, and I do it for his glory. And so I'm going to read this story about Eric. I think this is really cool. Eric was known because he had a staunch belief that he should not do anything on Sunday but worship and pray. And so some of us today might think, well, that's legalistic. But he believed it, and he wanted to set aside a day so that that's all he did was worship and pray. And so when he was selected for the 1924 Olympics, his special event was the 100-meter. And that's what he was supposed to just kill it in, was the 100-meter. Well, that race fell on Sunday. And so he told the Olympic committee and his other teammates on the Olympic team, he was like, "Guys, I'm out. I can't run on Sunday." And he faced all kinds of stuff for that. People tried to coerce him to do it. They tried to kick him off the team. They did all kinds of stuff to get him, but he held fast and he didn't do it. But then he went on to run these other races that he wasn't supposed to be so good in, and he shattered world records in them. But this is outside of his running. So I'm going to read this. It says, in the early 1920s, Eric's growing fame led to the first invitation to speak publicly about his faith. It came from the Glasgow Students' Union, the Students' Evangelistic Union, which was engaged with little success in an evangelistic rally in a hard-scrabble coal mining town outside of Edinburgh. But what if Scotland's fastest sprinter were among the speakers? Perhaps then the men would come and listen. So one of the group's founders, divinity student David Patrick Thompson, agreed to ask Liddell. He traveled all the way to Edinburgh and knocked on the door of the house that Eric shared with his older brother. Eric himself answered, and Thompson put the question to him. Eric thought about it for a few moments and then agreed to do it. But Eric hated public speaking. And no sooner had he given his assent than he began to regret it. The very next morning, he received a letter from his sister, Jenny. A letter. So it was in the mail. At the end, she quoted Isaiah 41:10 in the King James. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. Eric felt those words were God's way of speaking directly to him. Sometime later, he said that those words helped me make my decision, and since then I have endeavored to do the work of the Master. When Eric arrived at the meeting, he found some 80 coal miners waiting to hear him. Eric spoke quietly about his faith in Christ, of what God meant to him, and the strength he felt within him from the sure knowledge of God's love and support, how he never questioned anything that happened either to himself or to others. He didn't need explanations from God. He simply believed in him and accepted whatever came. Decades later, Eric's daughter Patricia noted that he felt then, now who's going to come and listen? But those times where he went speaking, huge crowds showed up. Eric brought in people who might not have been interested in religion, but were more interested in sports. Let's see what this sports hero has to say. Few who heard him speak would have claimed that Eric was a great speaker. His natural shyness kept him from being passionate in his oratory, but somehow his sincerity and self-deprecating humor came through. They certainly did that day. Many of the miners who had come to hear him were deeply moved, and news spread rapidly that the Flying Scotsman had spoken publicly about his faith in Christ. Eric soon joined the evangelism group and began speaking with them in town after town. Fitting in engagements during school holidays, it gave him great joy to know that God could use his athletic prowess in this way. Years before, Eric had committed himself to serving God, but it seemed he had few talents other than the ability to run like the wind. His heart's desire was to glorify God. He didn't think that being able to run fast, even as fast as he was of any eternal purpose. Why had God given him this world-class talent? What was the point? But now he began to see beyond the point. And he was suddenly tremendously grateful for this rare gift. As he later put it, my whole life had been one of keeping out of public duties, but the leading of Christ seemed now to be in the opposite direction, and I shrank from going forward. And at this time, I finally decided to put it all on Christ. After all, if he called me to do it, then he would have to supply the necessary power. And in going forward, the power was indeed given to me. There's a favorite Christian apologist of mine, a guy named Greg Kokel, and he's got a phrase that's really applicable to this. He says, bloom where you're planted, you know. And I think what he's talking about there is, the parable of the seeds. Wherever you land, bloom right there. You might be working as a plumber. You might be a carpenter. You might be an IT guy somewhere. Well, that's where you're planted. So God's calling you to bloom right there, to find some way to use that skill for his kingdom. Thanks so much for listening to me. I really appreciate the opportunity to come tonight. Hope you guys got a little something out of that. I know that I learned so much just preparing to come here, and it's been an honor to come and speak to you guys. So Thanks a bunch. I really appreciate it.